It's a calm afternoon in the Indian Ocean, far off the coast of West Australia. The pride of the Australian Navy, a powerful cruiser, HMAS Sydney, has spotted a lone cargo ship which is acting suspiciously. Sydney draws closer for a look, and before long, the two are sailing side by side at point-blank range. Sydney asks the stranger to hoist the secret signal of a friendly Allied ship, but it hesitates, and then all hell breaks loose.
Feuer frei!
Just how did one of the Australian Navy's most modern and deadly warships sink with the loss of all of its crew? This is the horrifying true story of the sinking of HMAS Sydney. September 1939. War breaks out dramatically in Europe after nearly a decade of rising tension. Adolf Hitler's military pours into Poland, dragging France, Britain and their allies into a devastating conflict. Before long, Hitler's armies have stormed into Holland, Belgium, France, Denmark and Norway. But while the heavy fighting is confined to the European continent, the oceans have now become the stage for an epic struggle for survival. The world's glorious peacetime oceanliners are mothballed or converted into drab troop transports for the war effort. Menacing battleships and cruisers prowl the waves, but below them, Germany's U-boat fleet hunts Allied shipping down with frightening prowess. Hitler knows that Britain is an island nation, and all island nations in wartime display the same Achilles heel. If enough supply ships cannot get through, then wide-scale production issues and food shortages are sure to follow. Britain and the Commonwealth, including Australia, Canada and New Zealand, rely on regular supplies from Allied nations, and without them, the war effort could grind to a halt. Allied merchant ships are slow and mostly defenceless, but they are numerous, so most of the German Navy's efforts are directed at culling that number, and they do so with remarkable efficiency. U-boats, the German submarines, are adept at this role, and they exact a devastating toll. But there's a problem. They can only carry so much fuel, so they need to operate nearby to friendly submarine bases or where they can be resupplied at sea. Ships, thanks to their size, have a much larger operating range. But a warship, like a cruiser or a battleship, will be almost impossible to conceal, and operating by itself, will be hunted down and destroyed. This happens to the German battleship Bismarck in May 1941. But the German Navy has another weapon up its sleeve, one which proved remarkably effective during the First World War: the Commerce Raider. The concept of the Commerce Raider goes back to the days of sail, when privateers, civilian crewed ships acting under a commission of war, would often disguise themselves as harmless civilian ships before dropping the ruse and attacking an unprepared opponent. The strategy played within the rules of war, so long as the disguise was dropped before attacking the enemy, and so long as the disguised ship flew its national ensign just before attacking. The concept was refined further during the First World War by both Germany and Britain, the latter famously deploying Q ships, which looked like innocent cargo vessels, but carried hidden guns. To the German Navy, the Commerce Raider was an ideal tool to rely on to hunt down and destroy Allied merchant ships outside of the range of the U-boats, and one of their raiders was named Kormoran. Kormoran had started life in 1938 as the Steiermark, built as a passenger cargo ship for the Hamburg America line. The ship was meant to operate as far as East Asia from Europe, but before she could ever enter service, the war had broken out, so the new ship sat idle. The Kriegsmarine, or the German Navy, had been secretly preparing for war during the 1930s. Limitations put on the German Navy after the First World War meant that their number of conventional warships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships and the like, was much lower than the Allied powers. To account for this, the Kriegsmarine had secretly identified merchant ships that they knew could be easily converted into deadly commerce raiders, and Steiermark was one of them. In early 1940, the ship was overhauled and turned into a fearsome hunter. By design, Steiermark was 164 metres long and 8,700 gross registered tonnes. She was powered by 4 9-cylinder diesel engines, providing a top speed of 18 knots, or 33 kilometres per hour. Originally, she had featured comfortable passenger cabins and cavernous cargo holds. but the cabins were gutted and replaced with bunks for sailors and gunners, while the cargo holds were converted to store naval mines and even prisoners, with separate lockups for both men and women if required. Crucially though, the Hunter was given its teeth. On deck she carried two 15cm naval guns, with 4 more below the forecastle and poop deck hidden behind hinged panels. The 2 guns on deck were hidden behind fake, collapsible cargo hatch walls that cocould be broken down in seconds. Behind sheet metal panels and on hydraulic mounts were 2cm automatic anti-aircraft cannons and a pair of 3.7cm light anti-tank guns that had been taken from the army. Devastating weaponry for any light targets, like the unarmoured merchant ships that Steiermark was expected to engage. On deck sat a pair of torpedo launchers with a single launcher underwater in the ship's hull on either side. Deep in the hold of the ship, she even carried an LS-3 fast motorboat and a pair of Arado AR-196 float planes for reconnaissance. High up above the bridge were disguised rangefinders that could direct the ship's gunfire with pinpoint accuracy. What emerged from the shipyard in September 1940 was a dangerous predator of a ship. Disguised as a friendly cargo ship, the Steiermark could drop its ruse and have its guns begin belching death in less than 10 seconds. She was a veritable floating Swiss Army knife of a ship, and she needed an able, adept commander to maximise her effectiveness. For this task, the Kriegsmarine chose 37-year-old Theodor Detmers, a former destroyer captain. It was often said that destroyer captains were a little bit mad, and indeed Detmers' determination and skill as a hunter would see him play the role of Steiermark's captain with devastating expertise. But first, he elected to give his ship a new name. The cormorant is a type of bird used by fishermen to catch and retrieve fish from rivers. The Allied merchant ships would be the fish, and Detmer's new raider would be the bird. He named her Kormoran. Provisioned for a year-long voyage, Kormoran's first job was to run the Allied blockade, and she escaped into the open ocean. Through December, she slipped by prowling British warships unnoticed in storms and heavy seas, way up over Iceland and through the Denmark Strait. It was a cautious move to take the long way around, but Detmers was calculating and cool, and he knew his ship would see action before long. In a fight with an Allied merchant ship or freighter, even one protected by a deck gun, Kormoran's heavy firepower would see her win every time. But an engagement with any warship bigger than a destroyer would see Kormoran destroyed. She had to rely on disguise and measured risk-taking to survive. Detmers began to hunt for merchant ships, travelling alone, without escort or in convoy. In January 1941, Kormoran claimed her first prize, sinking the Greek freighter Antonis. Later that month, Detmers engaged a British tanker, the British Union, which actually fired back when threatened. Kormoran's guns quickly disabled the ship, and her torpedoes sent it to the bottom of the ocean. For the next few months, Kormoran hunted ships like this in the Atlantic Ocean, sinking 8 for a total of 56,000 tonnes of Allied shipping. Kormoran was directed to hunt in the Indian Ocean, so Detmers had his ship disguised as the Japanese freighter Kinkamaru. By November 1941, Kormoran had been at sea for 11 months, but pickings in the Indian Ocean were slim, and she'd sunk only 3 merchant ships since relocating in June. Detmers now had Kormoran disguised as a Dutch freighter, the Straat Malacca, and his ship had been frequently repaired and resupplied at sea, but he must have been frustrated by his lack of success in the Indian Ocean. To change tack, he turned his ship for Western Australia to lay mines off the coast and catch any unassuming Australian merchant ships by surprise closer to home. Late in the afternoon of November 19th, 1941, Kormoran was steaming about 280 kilometres off the coast of West Australia when a call came from his lookouts that a tall sailing ship had been spotted ahead on the horizon. But a few minutes later, the tangle of masts and rigging on the horizon revealed themselves to actually belong to an Allied warship. A warship which had spotted Kormoran and was approaching to investigate. Detmer's worst fears had been realised, and Kormoran would have to pull off a masterful disguise or be drawn into a gun battle that she was never designed for. Detmers grit his teeth and decided on what to do. Aboard the bridge of HMAS Sydney, Captain Joseph Burnett peered through his binoculars at the mysterious ship in the distance. He was 41 years old, and Sydney was his first command. For his first ship, Burnett could have done a lot worse. Sydney was one of the finest, most modern warships in the Australian fleet. Australia still held close ties with Britain, and there was something of a codependency. Britain would supply and arm the Commonwealth, but expected Commonwealth assistance during wartime. Because of this, Australia's wartime fleet largely comprised second-hand Royal Navy warships. But Sydney was different. She had been purchased before completion by the Australian government. Originally, she was to have been named HMAS Phaeton, but she and two of her sisters were sold to Australia and renamed. Phaeton became the Sydney. The ship was launched in 1934 as a Leander-class light cruiser. She had long, lean lines and powerful turbines, which gave her a top speed of 32.5 knots. Bow to stern, she was 171 metres long and displaced 7,200 tonnes. Sydney and her two sisters were different to the 5 other British Leander-class ships. They had 2 separate and self-contained boiler and engine room groups, a practice which was adopted from the US Navy. This meant that if one boiler and engine room was knocked out, Sydney could still operate with reduced speed. This changed her profile and gave the ship a second functioning funnel. Sydney was armed with 8 6-inch guns housed twinned in armoured turrets, which had a maximum range out to over 22.5 kilometres. The guns were quick firing, and although of a small calibre, they could lob shells downrange at a rate of once every 7 or 8 seconds. The forward turrets were designated A and B turret, and the rear turrets were X and Y. Amidships, Sydney carried 4 4-inch deck guns which could be used against aircraft or surface targets, while dotted around the ship were quad-mounted 13mm Vickers anti-aircraft guns. On either side of the ship was mounted a quadruple torpedo launcher. Sydney certainly did not want for armament. For reconnaissance duties, she carried a Supermarine Walrus seaplane on a catapult and was fitted with a massive crane so she could pluck the Walrus back out of the water after it was done with its mission. Sydney was nimble, quick, and deadly, designed to engage from a distance, kiting away from incoming enemy fire, but nipping back with her quick-firing 6-inch guns. Sailing from Britain, Sydney first arrived in Australia in July 1935, where she became an object of curiosity to the general public. In a peacetime navy through the rest of the 1930s, Sydney became a familiar sight in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and other Australian ports as she made regular voyages for exercises and training. To the Australian public, Sydney and her sisters, Perth and Hobart, were a source of pride.
There's a track winding back to an old-fashioned shack along the road to Gundagai.
The nation was young and struggling to define its own national identity separate from Britain. Sydney and her sisters were up to standard as some of the world's finest fighting ships, and their crews were keen to show that they were up to standard as well.
Where my daddy and mother are waiting for me, and the pals of my childhood once more I will see. Then no more will I roam when I'm heading right home along the road.
The outbreak of war saw Sydney patrolling Australian territorial waters and the Indian Ocean, but everything changed in May 1940 when she was ordered to join British warships in the Mediterranean Ocean. The ship was personally chosen by British Admiral Andrew Cunningham to join the 7th Cruiser Squadron, and he was impressed by the ship and decided to keep it for himself. With the declaration of war by Italy on June 10, 1940, Sydney found itself on station in an active war zone, and her crew were anxious to do their nation proud. On the 21st of June, Sydney fired her guns in anger for the first time, bombarding the Italian-controlled port of Bardia. 7 days later, she engaged her first enemy ship, firing on the disabled Italian destroyer Espero and sinking her. Over the coming weeks, Sydney served with distinction, first at the Battle of Calabria and then at the Battle of Cape Sparta. This was her most glorious moment, the opportunity to earn the nation's pride that her eager crew had so long been looking for. On July 19th, a small force of British destroyers chanced upon a pair of Italian cruisers and retreated at speed, with the Italians in pursuit. The Italian captains were then horrified to see the Sydney appear, guns blazing on the horizon. The Italian ships turned to run, but Sydney's quick-firing 6-inch guns got to work, damaging the first and then disabling the second Italian cruiser, the Bartolomeo Colleoni. Sydney's crew were elated, never mind the fact that their ship had copped an Italian shell straight through the forward funnel. John Collins, her commander, was appointed a Companion of the Order of the Bath, while the ship's other officers and crew received a mix of 2 Distinguished Service Orders, 2 Distinguished Service Crosses, 5 Distinguished Service Medals, and 12 mentions and dispatches. Back home, Sydney was lauded as a hero, and the entire nation of Australia collectively beamed with pride. Sydney served in the Mediterranean until the end of 1940, when she received urgent news from home. German commerce raiders were prowling unhindered in the waters around Australia, and the island nation needed a guardian. Sydney was the perfect choice for such a task. By nature, thanks to her speed and rapid firepower, she was a hunter, and normally a commerce raider wouldn't stand a chance against her in a gun battle. Sydney arrived at her namesake port finally in February of 1941 to a hero's welcome. School children were even given a holiday to join the thousands and thousands of people who turned out to cheer the ship and her crew on. Over the next few months, Sydney patrolled the waters of Australia, escorting convoys comprised of merchant ships and even massive ocean liners like the Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth and Aquitania. In November 1941, Sydney had been escorting the troop ship Zealandia off West Australia, but she was relieved on station and turned for home. Then, late in the afternoon of November 19th, smoke was spotted on the horizon. It was a lone merchant ship, and Burnett, Sydney's new captain, couldn't help but investigate. He turned his ship to pursue. On board the Kormoran, Detmers took only seconds to decide on what to do. He immediately ordered his ship be turned into the sun. That would make it harder for the enemy warship to see him and figure out its true identity. The Dutch ensign was run up the foremast, and Detmers called his crew to action stations. He knew that a gun battle at range would see his ship shot out from underneath him. He had to get the enemy close enough to exact a terrible, devastating blow. But to do this, he would need all his cunning and creativity. On his side was the element of surprise. The enemy warship was clearly interested in them, but turning to run away into the sun had only piqued that suspicion further. Kormoran was disguised as Straat Malacca, the Dutch freighter, so Detmers would use this false identity to lure the warship in as close as possible. He observed the distant warship through a sighting telescope of a gunnery control station. It was an Australian light cruiser making full speed for his ship, and the chase had begun. Kormoran struggled along at 14 knots, hampered by a malfunctioning engine and months of marine growth on the hull. But the Australian ship was getting closer and closer, nearly doubling the German ship's speed. Then came a challenge. The Australian ship flashed a Morse signal, NNJ, but nobody on Kormoran knew what this meant, so they didn't answer. Then came another Morse signal. What ship? For this, Detmers had an answer, and a plan. To buy himself time and lure the Australian ship closer within the range of his guns and torpedoes, Detmers ordered his signalman to reply to the question not with a Morse lamp, but slowly with signal flags one at a time. This would give the appearance of an inexperienced, possibly scared civilian crew and would help sell Kormoran's disguise even further. After a few minutes, Kormoran had signalled she was Straat Malacca, and Sydney was now only 15,000 metres away. Whenever Sydney asked a question, Kormoran's signalman would bumble, send up the wrong flag seemingly on accident, and then take his time. But Sydney was getting impatient and began repeating its questions. At 4:30 p.m, Sydney was only 8,000 metres away and had quizzed Kormoran on where she was bound and what kind of cargo she was carrying. The mood on board Kormoran must have been incredibly tense, but so far, the ruse was working. On Sydney, Captain Burnett was playing a risky game. He had been briefed in depth on the presence of enemy commerce raiders operating in the Indian Ocean, and his standing orders advised against approaching mystery vessels at close range. Sydney's huge firepower advantage was most useful at long distance. Even though she was a warship, she was only a light cruiser, lightly armoured and intended for harassing and providing fire support at range. Burnett was clearly suspicious about this mystery freighter called the Straat Malacca, so he inched Sydney closer to get a better look. Why he did this has been debated for decades. It's been thought that he suspected this ship was actually a German supply vessel in the area waiting to resupply one of the commerce raiders. Capturing it intact would be a major coup for the commander, so closing the range and boarding her before her crew had a chance to plant explosive charges and deliberately sink their own ship seemed like a sound plan. As Sydney drew closer, Detmers noticed that all 4 of Sydney's main gun turrets were trained menacingly on his ship. He began to think like a civilian merchant ship captain. What would an inexperienced commander do in a situation like this? Well, probably panic. He ordered his radio operator to send the distress signal QQQQ, the Royal Navy distress call for a ship suspecting it was under attack from a commerce raider. He gave his ship's name as Strat Malacca and his position, and he hoped that the signal, which he repeated, would cause serious confusion aboard the Australian warship. By now, Sydney was just 3,000 metres away. The Walrus seaplane on Sydney was run out with its engine on, but it didn't launch, and it just sat on the catapult. Detmers called into a speaking phone to his gunnery control crew. "Our camouflage is excellent," he said. "He has no suspicion. Maybe they will say good voyage and let us go." By 5:15, Sydney had drawn perfectly alongside Kormoran at point-blank range, just 900 metres away. Her guns were still trained on the ship, but her crew clearly weren't too concerned because through their looking glasses the Germans could see Australian sailors and crewmen smoking and chatting idly on the deck. Detmers and his crew held their breath. The might of the Royal Australian Navy had bared down on them, and now there could be no escape. Then came a message that Detmers simply had no answer to. "Show your secret signal," the Sydney demanded. Detmers turned to his senior wireless officer. "Do we know the secret call for the Strat Malacca?" he asked. In response, the officer just shook his head. Detmers realised that the time had come, and he gave his orders. The disguise would be dropped. Up the masthead shot the battle ensign of Nazi Germany, and then all hell broke loose. Two shots from Kormoran's 15cm guns missed, and Sydney answered with a full broadside salvo. The ships were so close together that Sydney's guns were not depressed low enough and the shells passed close overhead. But if Kormoran's 15cm guns had proved ineffective so far, the 20mm anti-aircraft guns and the 3.7cm anti-tank guns were doing devastating work. The Australian crew, who had been idle on the deck just moments before, now found themselves cut down by heavy anti-aircraft gun fire. The two ships were so close that the 3.7cm guns easily penetrated Sydney's thin superstructure. Their first priority target was the bridge. Captain Burnett's surprise and horror must have been total, but it couldn't have lasted long because Kormoran's gunfire raked the bridge where Burnett stood and turned it into bloody ruin. Then Kormoran's 15cm guns found their range and hammered Sydney stem to stern with heavy shelling, finishing off in the bridge what the anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns had started. The damage was severe. Sydney had been caught completely by surprise. It had only been 20 seconds since Kormoran's first shot, but Sydney's commander and most of her senior officers were already likely dead. Kormoran's 15cm guns were remarkably effective and they silenced Sydney's forward A and B turrets, which only ever got to fire that first high salvo. The Supermarine Walrus seaplane, still waiting with its engine turning on the catapult, received a direct hit and exploded, spilling aviation fuel all over the decks and starting a raging fire. Meanwhile, Kormoran's 20mm anti-aircraft guns blasted away, keeping Sydney's men from reaching the exposed torpedo mounts and 4-inch guns. Sydney had been silent since that first salvo and was now burning fiercely, but then X and Y turret burst into life again and lobbed shells at Kormoran. Sydney's main fire control station had been knocked out, so the crew in X and Y turrets had to just judge for themselves the range and firing angle. And incredibly, X turret found their mark, and a shell tore straight through Kormoran's funnel. More shells landed on Kormoran's hull, the engine room, the gun stations, and then the electrical plant, cutting off supply for the ship's main generators. Incredibly, these two modern warships were now sailing side by side at point-blank range, exchanging gunshots like a pair of 17th century galleons. Sydney's two remaining gun turrets fired on, the only defence the ship now had against this surprise enemy. But then, there was an enormous explosion, and Sydney trembled in the water. Detmers had fired a spread of torpedoes at the warship early in the engagement. One had now hit on the warship's bow, a devastating blow that almost submerged the bow of the ship through its sheer force. Just 2 minutes into the engagement, and Sydney was now mortally wounded. Her bow down in the water, the heroic cruiser now peeled pathetically off to port, but whether this was a deliberate attempt to ram Kormoran or just an uncontrolled turn remains unclear. The turn opened Sydney's starboard side up to Kormoran's guns, and they raked her from stem to stern as she passed by. Sydney's A and B turrets exploded as they were hit by multiple 15-centimetre shells. By now, Sydney was just limping along at 5 knots, with X and Y turret pointing in the wrong direction. They had no answer to Kormoran's fire. Detmers wanted to close the range again, which had now increased to 4,000 metres, so he could finish the cruiser off. But Kormoran's engine revolutions were falling, and his attempts to raise the engine room via telephone from the bridge failed. He got no response because the engineers had most likely all been killed. For most ships, a hit to the funnel would be purely cosmetic and be no cause for concern. But Kormoran employed a complex system of piping within the funnel which carried fuel oil up to be heated before being pumped back down into the boilers. This was more efficient for her engines, but it also meant that Sydney's hit on the funnel sent a cascading fountain of burning fuel oil back down into the Raider's boiler and engine rooms, incinerating the men on watch and rendering the engine rooms useless. Kormoran began to vibrate as her engine revolutions raced out of control, but her gun crews continued to hammer Sydney at range. Finally, at 6:25, just 55 minutes since battle had broken out, Kormoran ceased fire at a range of 10,400 metres. Detmers knew that the battle was won, but now he had to tend to his wounded ship. Sydney's bow lay low in the water and she was burning fiercely from the bridge to the after funnel. Through the night, Sydney drifted and burned over the horizon, lighting the night sky with a glow that Kormoran's crew could see in the darkness. Sometime after midnight, Sydney's damaged bow detached from the hull and the ship sank. The pride of Australia's navy and people slipped beneath the waves. There were no survivors.